Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a special program from the Massachusetts Historical Society, the awarding of the 2020 Peter J. Gomes Memorial Book Prize to Professor Kerri Greenidge of Tufts University. My name is Kenneth Wong Street Chanelai. I am the Director of Research at the Massachusetts Historical Society. The Massachusetts Historical Society established the Peter J. Gomes Memorial Book Prize 6 years ago in honor of the late Reverend Professor Peter J. Gomes. Reverend Gomes was the Plumer Professor of Christian Morals and the Pusey Minister of the Memorial Church at Harvard University. He was also an overseer, elected fellow, and board member of the Massachusetts Historical Society. A zealous preacher, orator, and lover of history, especially Massachusetts history, he often quoted the book of Romans and urged people to be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Sound historical scholarship, written for a broad audience, helps both transform and renew one's mind. In that spirit, and in memory of Reverend Gomes, who passed away in 2011, the MHS presents this award for the best nonfiction work in the history of Massachusetts, published in the preceding year. This year's competition included 18 works that covered race, political, geographic, and urban history topics. The works spanned hundreds of years of history from the 17th to the 20th century, and the selection committee was represented by judges from outside the Historical Society and included scholars whose scholarship spanned the colonial period to modern times. The committee selected as the winner of this year's Peter J. Gomes Memorial Book Prize, Kerri Greenidge's Black Radical, The Life and Times of William Monroe Trotter, published by Live Right Publishing in 2019. This evening's program will proceed in the following order. I shall introduce the Historical Society's president, Dr. Catherine Allgore, who will make a few remarks. After that, Dr. Greenidge will join Dr. Annette Gordon-Reed of Harvard University in conversation. I shall introduce both of them as that portion of the program commences. Drs. Greenidge and Gordon-Reed will converse for approximately 35 minutes before we open the floor to questions from the audience members. But you may type your questions into the Q&A box at any time during the program. And now, it is my pleasure to welcome the president of the Massachusetts Historical Society, Catherine Allgore.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this year's awarding of the Peter J. Gomes Memorial Book Prize. In a normal year, we would all be gathered in Ellis Hall at 1154 Boylston Street, our beloved headquarters for over a century. With the pandemic, that is not possible. We are all separated by distances great and small, but we dream of a day when we can return to gather, mingle, learn, congratulate, and toast together again. The subject of Kerri Greenidge's biography dreamed too. He dreamed of a republic that lived up to its creed and fulfilled its promise to all its citizens. And for that dream, he was viewed as a radical. Black Radical, The Life and Times of William Monroe Trotter, in Greenidge's words, is the story of an African-American political leader and civil rights agitator who did more than any other newspaper editor of his generation to inspire radical Black consciousness at the turn of the 20th century. At a time when the Black press was owned and operated by racial conservatives, Black and white, who stifled Black dissent for the sake of white comfort and racial respectability, Trotter's newspaper, Guardian, galvanized Black working people to recognize and embrace their political power. Unafraid to criticize the Black elite, of which he was a part, and unintimidated by white opinion or public approval, Trotter inspired two generations of Black people across the diaspora to demand the civil rights and racial justice promised, yet violently denied by emancipation and Reconstruction. Black Radical puts both Trotter and the city of Boston front and center, where neither, as Greenidge notes, are typically acknowledged for their significant role in radical civil rights leadership. Greenidge says, Beyond Black Bostonians' role as radical abolitionists in the decades before the Civil War, the city is frequently dismissed as a gateway to Black success rather than an incubator for Black radical politics. In fact, it was a stomping ground for both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., the site of inspiration for editor Pauline Hopkins and Harlem Renaissance writer Dorothy West. Its surrounding area, particularly the renowned institutions across New England, were also significant in the ideological development of Barack Obama, Senator Edward Brooke, and former Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick. The selection committee praised Black Radical as, quote, a very readable corrective to idealized and simplified descriptions of this time in Massachusetts history, and is especially valuable in highlighting both the local and national story of race relations from Reconstruction to the Great Depression. The book, they contend, is thus much more than a straight biography. Greenidge examines the subtle variation in ideology, beliefs, and tactics among numerous activists and traces both political and personal relationships. Highlighting Trotter's personal role in this history alone would be significant, but by writing a well-contextualized biography, Greenidge shows the reader how successes and failures, collaborations and divisions were often more complex than simple political questions and were indeed much more varied than many typical narratives suggest. Using his Guardian newspaper, Greenidge writes, Trotter, quote, placed Boston at the center of radical African-American politics and forced the overwhelmingly white city to live up to the most progressive version of itself. Thanks to Dr. Greenidge, we remember Trotter and his radical vision. Thanks to her, that vision lives on as we seek now and that time when we're together to live up to that vision in our own time and place. Kerri Greenidge, you are the deserving recipient of the 2020 Peter J. Gomes Memorial Book Prize. Congratulations.
Thank you, Catherine, and congratulations, Kerri.
Thank you so much.
All right, so to join us in discussion today, Kerri Greenidge is Mellon Assistant Professor in the Department of Studies in Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora at Tufts University. She also serves as the Interim Director of the American Studies Program at Tufts. Dr. Greenidge co-directs the African American Trail Project, a collaborative public history initiative that seeks to map African American and African descended public history sites across Greater Boston and Massachusetts. The project's aim is to, quote, develop African American historical memory and intergenerational community, placing present-day struggles for racial justice in the context of Greater Boston's historic African American, Black Native, and diasporic communities. She previously worked for the Boston African American National Historical Site, where she also published her first book, Boston Abolitionists. Dr. Annette Gordon-Reed is the Carl M. Loeb University Professor at Harvard University. Her numerous works have garnered 16 book prizes, including the Frederick Douglass Book Prize, the George Washington Book Prize, and the Pulitzer Prize in History. Her works include Race on Trial, Law and Justice in American History, The Hemmingses of Monticello, An American Family, for which she received the Pulitzer Prize, and most recently, with co-author Peter Onuf, Most Blessed of the Patriarchs, Thomas Jefferson and the Empire of the Imagination. She is an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, and a trustee of the Massachusetts Historical Society. Ladies and gentlemen, Drs. Greenidge and Gordon-Reed.
Kerri, congratulations. This is really great.
Thank you so much. I'm so overwhelmed and happy. And I say thank you to the Mass Historical Society and Catherine. Thank you for that beautiful introduction and Kid and everybody over there. I did a lot of my research in the MHS, so I thank you very much. And of course, thank you to you, Annette Gordon-Reed. You're one of my intellectual idols. I've read Hemmings of Monticello probably 5-6 times. Just sort of the craft of it alone is very inspiring. So thank you so much.
Thank you for saying that. That's very kind of you. This is he's always fascinated me, William Monroe Trotter, and I've always wondered why he is not better known. I mean, for all of the things that he did, really extraordinary things. Why do you think that's the case?
I think there's many reasons for that. I think that one of them is that Trotter did not have children. So
Hmm.
unlike many of the people we revere in history generally, he didn't have somebody culling through his life and presenting him
Hmm.
to the world. The other thing I think is that he was very close and had very contentious relationships with his contemporaries, W.E.B. Du Bois,
Hmm.
Kelly Miller,
Hmm.
obviously Booker T. Washington. And so many of those people who wrote much of the history of their era tended to openly ignore him and downplay his contribution. So I think that's it. I also think that Trotter was a difficult person to grasp because he was somebody who his ideas, his politics, his networking was all done through his newspaper. And
Hmm.
so it's hard to find letters. It's hard to find, like an essay that he wrote or a series of books that he wrote. It's really a deep dive into the paper that he left behind.
Hmm. So it's interesting, the idea of not having kids who are sort of the keepers of the flame. That's certainly where somebody like Jefferson, I mean, obviously, who was president. So there are lots of reasons people would pay attention to him. But he did have a family,
Yep.
grandchildren, that sort of kept his story alive and his papers and so forth. And Trotter didn't have that. You mentioned that he was a difficult person, an
Yes.
incredibly difficult person. Um, do you, as a biographer, and when you write about people, you think you come to know them in some ways, do you understand why? A couple of things. Why was he difficult, and what was the spark that led him to want to be so, vociferous on behalf of Black rights? I mean, I know there are many people who had the idea that they wanted to do that, but number one, why is he so difficult? Or maybe the two are together. He's
Yeah.
difficult because of the things that he encountered in trying to do this, but what made him tick?
I think it's an interesting question because sitting with all the sources, one of the things I noticed about him was that he was somebody who was a tenacious activist at heart. But he was also somebody who, as an activist, often could not separate the activism and the political from the personal. And
Mhm.
that's a very powerful thing in terms of activism. But throughout a life, it can often alienate the person. And, I think those of us who do work sometimes across, people we don't necessarily agree with, it can be difficult to maintain, you know, um, relationships with those people. But I also think that Trotter was, Du Bois said he was entirely sincere. And Du Bois's comment on that was that he was so sincere that it often made it very difficult for him to respectfully disagree or collaborate or discuss with his contemporaries. In terms of his difficulty, I think he was born 1872. He came from a family of activists. His father escaped from slavery in Mississippi. His mother was from Charlottesville, Virginia, as you cover sort of that um, history of free Black people in that area of Virginia. And so he grew up always understanding that Black freedom was a process and a vigorous politics of Black people themselves. He was never somebody who believed, as far as I could tell, that Black people were going to be delivered by somebody, right? That somebody was going to come in and give Black people their rights. And he knew that from a very early age. And so I believe that in terms of his worldview, that could often be, um, um, particularly given the kind time he lived in, when people are, horrendous racial violence, economic devastation, the promise of Reconstruction only to be destroyed in his lifetime, that made it difficult for him to collaborate because he was so sincere and because he was somebody who honestly in his heart believed that Black people were going to decide and dictate their destiny.
Mhm. So how would, if you mentioned Du Bois and obviously Washington and other people who were involved in the movement, the struggle at that time period, how would you differentiate him from other people? How is he not a Du Bois? How is he not a Washington? Where does he fit on a continuum? Or, if you try to decide what is his distinctive thing that made him who he was, what role was he playing?
3 words he always said, which was agitate, agitate, agitate. That's sort of one of the statements that he made in his newspaper. And just personally, he was situated between Du Bois and Washington in the sense that he fundamentally disagreed with Booker T. Washington that Black people could negotiate, find common ground with the former Confederacy.
Mm-hmm.
He did not believe that the South, the rural South as it existed in the late 19th century, was the field upon which Black people should construct and build their movement. He really believed that the South was far too dangerous. It had betrayed African-American people, and that Black people, needed to move and needed to form activist networks outside of the immediate South where the majority of Black people lived at the time. So in that way, he fundamentally disagreed with Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was a conservative and a brilliant kind of political negotiator in his own right. And Trotter really couldn't stomach the fact that Washington was willing to, often to the detriment of African-American people, work with and collaborate with Southern whites. In terms of his relationship to Du Bois, he and Du Bois had a long relationship, friendship. Du Bois actually originally was trying to date the woman who William O. Trotter married, so they had kind of this weird relationship and rivalry. Du Bois wrote of Trotter when they were at Harvard. So Du Bois was in graduate school and Trotter was an undergraduate. He wrote that he was not just sincere, but he was a leader from the beginning, and that Trotter, unlike most people, was not afraid to be Black at Harvard in the 1890s. It was unapologetic, but was also somebody who was a leader and garnered respect from Black and white students. And Du Bois' famous quote about Harvard was that I was in it, but not of it. And so that, I think, really characterized the different outlooks that both of them had on their respective futures. Du Bois became a radical over time. But when they knew each other and were closest in the from roughly 1901 to roughly 1910, Du Bois was really somebody who was a scholar and really believed fundamentally that his work was through writing and researching and carving this place of Black history and Black being into sociology and history. Whereas Trotter was never a scholar. He was somebody who really believed and faulted Du Bois for failing to be somebody who was an activist as well as a learned person.
Well, I should say to people watching that we have a connection. We have a point of connection here because of our work. William Monroe Trotter was a descendant of Elizabeth Hemings. So he has a connection to Monticello and to Charlottesville and the Hemings family there and the Fawcett family and so forth. Did this figure at all in his consciousness? Do you know?
Yes. So one of the things, and I preface this by saying, I've read your book over and over. And when I was crafting the book, biography of Trotter, he was somebody who always said his rhetoric about himself was that his mother was a descendant of Monticello. And of course, everybody at the time claimed that this was not true. Trotter also remembered hearing stories.
Why would they say it wasn't true? I mean, that
people in the early 20th century would say that one of the criticisms
that he didn't come from Monticello. I mean, obviously there were people.
they didn't come from Monticello, but also there was an argument. I'm thinking of Kelly Miller in the 1920s saying that this was part of Trotter's inflation of himself. That there was no way he was from Boston. There's no way he had connections to Monticello. And Trotter really grew up as somebody who this was their family history, their family story. And as you chronicle, the role of myth in creating and sustaining African-American history in the absence of acknowledging that that history exists. So he
Mhm.
got a lot of criticism during his lifetime for that, but during his life, he spent his summers in Chillicothe, Ohio, at the
Mhm.
farm that his grandfather, Tucker Isaacs,
Mhm.
owned and
Mhm.
used to help fugitive enslaved people and free people from Charlottesville over the mountains into southern Ohio. So he had that as a cultural and I would argue a very visceral memory. His family still kept the musket that his grandfather Tucker Isaacs used when he would travel back and forth rescuing fugitive slaves. Trotter's mother, Virginia Isaacs, was somebody who could remember being like a little girl and being taught how to shoot because she would go with her father's family over the border between the two states. And so this was, in terms of it could not be understated the role that consciousness,
Mhm.
a knowledge of that history
Mhm.
had on him, particularly at a time when many people were arguing and inventing this narrative that Southern slavery was benevolent and that Black people did not, fight or resist their enslavement.
Mhm. That's sort of an interesting idea, the notion of using Monticello as that people that he would use it as a part of his story. But I mean, not interesting in the sense that because it's true. Obviously, he's mentioning this part of it, but that he knew that people would know that, people would understand the significance of that, and that Kelly Miller would deny this and say that he's trying to elevate himself, and that he would think that being from Monticello, I guess what I'm getting at is elevating. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
An interesting kind of thing to be. Obviously, none of these people thought slavery was okay,
Yeah.
but to attach yourself to this place that's associated with this guy,
Yes.
as if you were there, that means that your family was enslaved there. But this becomes a point of pride, a point of distinction. Maybe pride is too strong a word. A distinction that a person who is well, I guess it makes sense if he's trying to make the American promise real,
Yes.
and the promise through the Declaration. You could kind of say, oh, and I have this particular connection there. It's a fascinating story, and
Yeah.
fascinating the way people responded to it.
Yeah, it is. It is fascinating. This particularly this idea at the time period. That period. Decades straddling the beginning of the 20th century, where many of the infighting amongst African American intellectuals and activists was that there was pretension amongst people like Trotter, who were descended from free people who were free before emancipation,
Mhm.
and that they had this pretentious way of talking about and vilifying, again, Kelly Miller's words, the South. And
Mhm.
so a lot of when Trotter would say, my family comes from that area, you can't accuse me of not having ties to the South.
Okay. Mhm.
It often became, it was a source of pride for Trotter, but he also used it rhetorically in many instances to argue about why the South had changed over time. And
Mhm.
at that specific moment, again, those 2 decades straddling the 20th century,
Mhm.
Black people, for their lives and for their political future, had to leave it behind, even though he himself had preserved this family legacy within Virginia.
Mhm. So Boston figures in the book as well. Why Boston for these groups of people? What is it? What is the alchemy? What is the situation that allows someone like him to flourish there and not other places? Because
Well, one of the
I mean, the image of Boston today
yes,
is maybe not fair, but that it isn't the place that you would think
exactly.
that there would be this
Exactly.
the Athens of Black America, or whatever you want to call it.
Yes.
What's the story there?
Well, the story is for this very specific period in time, roughly the end of the Civil War, I argue till like the 1920s, 1930s. Massachusetts was significant for 3 main reasons in the Black diasporic imagination. Number one, it was the first state to pass a Civil Rights Act in 1865.
Mhm.
Number two, it had a legacy of education, publicly funded education for African American people, and as I point out in the book, a uh, a history of educating African American, ambitious African American people at predominantly white schools like Harvard, Amherst,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
MIT when it was eventually created.
Mhm.
There was the second reason it was sort of had this place in the imagination was because it had ties to Black radical abolition
Mhm.
in the antebellum period. It was the home of David Walker. Um, that many people still recalled as of 1905 with the Niagara movement that African American people had stormed the courthouse during fugitive slave rescues in the 1850s. So it had a very different role in the imagination of Black people at the time. It also had a relationship, and I put this out in the book, with the diaspora very, very early on. So one of the statistics I point out is that for every single census since 1790, at least 10% of Bostonians who are defined as Black or Negro are foreign born. And in 2010, it was more, something like 25 to 30%. And so one of the things I argue is that this created the fact that you always had a small but persistent community of African American people from Cape Verde and Brazil and the Caribbean, right, gave the Black community a different political mindset, particularly right after the Civil War,
Mhm.
than other places, say Atlanta and Charleston and all these places.
Mhm.
Boston was also a place that had a very small yet very politically active Black community. And so the first African Americans are elected to the state legislature from in Massachusetts in 1867 and 1868. This meant that African American people had, for such a small population, never more than 2% of the population, had a say in government well into the 20th century. And so at the same time that elsewhere in the country, there's very violent disenfranchisement, African Americans consistently elected in Boston and across Massachusetts and New England representatives to the state legislature. This meant that they could create laws that were specific to them. They could advocate for things like the state support of an anti-lynching law when few other states were openly supporting it. And they, I argue in the book, they argued kind of as we think of a swing voter. The numbers were small, but the close election process that took place from roughly 1890 up to the 1930s on local elections that were very, very close, so that somebody would win by 2,000 votes or 5,000 votes. Black population, coincidentally, is that number of people. And so Trotter's point, and a point that was very inspirational to many African Americans at the time, was that at the time that most people were arguing against Black voting, where they were fighting for the very rights enshrined in the Constitution, African Americans in Boston were having a very different conversation, which was who do we elect to office because we can vote them in? Who should we vote? Somebody who's going to be a labor activist or somebody who's going to be more tied to business? And so it was a different orientation in terms of what we would think of today.
And they're getting elected with white votes.
Yes.
Obviously, I mean, so whites are supporting them. The issue in the South, obviously, is there were during Reconstruction, they're electing people, but they're electing people because there are lots of Black votes in Mississippi or Texas and other places. So here, whites are willing to vote for African Americans. Is it, well, do you think the numbers influence that? I mean, in the sense that there are not that many Black people. The very fact that there are not that many means that they had freer range to do things as opposed to 50-50 Mississippi or 3-1 South Carolina, that kind of thing. That there was no shot that Bostonians or people in Massachusetts would feel that they're being overrun by the Negro vote or whatever.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And I actually, when I was doing all the research and going through all of the political records, I was thinking, Yeah, I had this question of why you can't argue that white people in Massachusetts were somehow less racist, right? So why would they gather around Black Republicans and Democrats and independents who were running at the time? And I do think it had a lot to do with the size of the Black population. I think there was definitely a Yankee sensibility that was very paternalistic and that argued that African American people in Massachusetts, they were like special ones, right?
And
The
special ones,
the special
different
ones, right?
yes,
And
yeah.
so, of course, if they were, and I'm thinking of one of the governors of Massachusetts, James Michael Curley, saying, well, of course, our Negroes, right? We don't mind them voting. What really sort of gets into underneath the skin of the white power structure is as the Black population starts to include more Southern migrants, right? And there's this real demarcation in the white imagination that we have good Black people who are from like the Caribbean and from New England, and then we have this other group of people who are threatening to kind of ruin what we have going on here. So I'm always very careful in the book of saying it does not mean at all that somehow white people in Boston and Massachusetts were more accepting. It does mean that there is this history of Black people involved politically. Property owning Black men in Massachusetts could vote back in the 1780s. And so there was a different relationship between the way racism viewed Black enfranchisement in Massachusetts and the way racist disenfranchisers viewed voting in, say, Mississippi.
Yeah, there's the history is different, and so it created a different kind of context. Why Cape Verdeans and why the reason for that large contingent of foreign-born people? Is it instead of Philadelphia, or do you know, in comparing to other cities, is it more, or is it just the fact that they are in this place that has a history that allows that you just described before? Is Boston a destination?
Yeah, it's in this place that adds a history. I'm thinking of wonderful work by one of my mentors at BU is Marilyn Halter, who did a lot of work on Cape Verdean migration and the complications of race specifically in southern New England. There's people who have looked at the migration, Winston James, who looks a lot at Caribbean migration. And so Boston, New England being a port going all the way back to the 1600s, having a lot of contact economically and politically with in the British Empire with the Caribbean and South America. And the history of the maritime trade. So the fact that through the 19th century, the Black community was very mobile in a different way than it was in other areas. Seafaring and being a sailor were the most popular employment for men of African descent in Massachusetts. And so there's part of it is that. The other part in this that I found was the economic relationship between white Yankee businessmen, say in United Fruit, what becomes United Fruit Company, and Caribbean sugar plantations that they ran. And so there's a lot of exchange, migration of people of African descent from the Caribbean to Boston at the time, at a time when Caribbean people were migrating to both Miami and to New York City.
It's interesting. It's an interesting connection to think about New England's connection to the Caribbean and with slavery, during the time of slavery, there was a carryover from that particular time. You keep mentioning the Yankees. What about the Irish? I mean, I had a student do a master's paper, a thesis about Blacks and Irish people in Boston and how for a time there was cooperation among, between, again, you think of Boston today, some of the difficulties that Irish Americans and Black people had because of the busing crisis.
Yes.
And so that's colored the way we see all of this. But this paper that she did showed me very clearly that, over time, in that particular time you're talking about in Boston, there was more cooperation between Irish and Blacks.
Yes, there was. And it's actually fascinating, your students' work, because that's one of the things that I touched upon in the beginning of the book, but also really I think is an understudied portion of the field, just in sort of what happens between the relationship between African Americans and Irish Catholics in the Northeast, specifically in Boston after the Civil War. One of the things to remember is that beyond the similar economic circumstances of Irish Catholic immigrants and African Americans in Boston, there was a real sense beginning in the 1870s and 1880s that politically, and this is in Boston, the Black community in Boston, the Republican Party had betrayed Black people. And that the last good Republican, in Clement Morgan's words, was Charles Sumner, and he dies. And then there's nobody left.
And there's nobody left, they're all gone.
There's nobody left after that, right? And so the Irish Catholic community in Boston at the same time is coalescing around realizing its own political power as just a voting bloc, and in local government, and being elected to mayor in the city of Boston. And so I would argue that the relationship between the Black community and the Irish Catholic community was strongest during this 1880s and 1890s period, because they had this common political enemy in the Republican Party, and because they realized and recognized that they were workers at a time when Massachusetts was the most industrialized and industrializing state in the country. Now, this changed drastically once, New York and Pennsylvania and what we now call the Rust Belt kind of grew to prominence in terms of industry in the early 20th century. But there was that slight little window where I'm thinking of John Boyle O'Reilly, who was the poet and also a Fenian, part of the Fenian movement in Ireland, who was very allied with the Black community, would shame Irish Catholics who tried to think of themselves as better than Black. So I think it's like this period where there was a lot of possibility, and then for various reasons, one of them being kind of the realignment of the political system, that alliance dissipated.
So you lived with this person as a character for all of this book. Did your view of him change from what you expected when you started out working on this to the end? Did your understanding of him, your feelings about him evolve?
Yeah, my feelings. So I began, and I would actually ask you, as you were writing about the Hemmings, as a similar question, like how you're, particularly since you keep going back and doing such wonderful work on like this man and his relationship. I think that for me, the way I look at Trotter, I started looking at him as somebody who was rooted in that Black abolitionist tradition. And I kind of bought into the idea that was part of the scholarship, which is that, well, he was very provincial. And so that's why he didn't have much of an impact. That's really kind of how I went into the piece looking at him. And then when I started to just go into the archive and read the newspapers and the letters, realizing that he had an impact in a very real way on younger Black radicals. So Cyrus Briggs and Richard B. Moore, and all of these people who were the African Brotherhood, and Marcus Garvey, that he, at a time when Black people were told one thing about their history, and Trotter insisted that that thing they were told was wrong, a whole generation of people loved that about him, whether or not they agreed with him politically, or whether or not they actually, purchased the newspaper so he became wealthy. They were very much inspired by, again, that sincerity that Du Bois talked about. And so I think that's what changed my view. I really went into doing research on him thinking, okay, the book's going to end like around 1910, he then like disappears, and then finding all of this, just him everywhere, showing up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, right before the massacre there, him talking to Cape Verde seamen in Boston, right? And so I think seeing in all the sort of wells that he put his hands into, I think was a surprise, and made me look at him very differently than I did before.
Was there one thing that sort of, not just necessarily about him, but during the process of doing this, that you just said, wow, I did not know that? or were there moments when you just find yourself, because that happens sometimes,
Yes.
and I think, gee, wow, look at this. How did I miss this? Or why don't people write about this? Are there any, what are some of the, or aha moments that you had?
Oh my, I has a lot of them. I want to hear what yours are too. Mine, I think was just recognizing how deeply rich that period of African and African diasporic history is between the end of the American Civil War and um, the interwar period.
Mhm.
That there's so much going on, and that these communities are being made and remade, destroyed and then reborn all over the country, but particularly outside of the places we traditionally think, like Atlanta, New York, Chicago, Detroit.
Mhm.
And that always surprised me, was that, oh my goodness, there's this little town right outside of Chicago and they elected their own Black police officer and he protested against lynching in this town, and you never hear about that. So I think that was the most eye-opening to me, that there's so many stories out there
Mhm.
that historians, it's just sort of a wealth of stuff that historians can delve into, that can change the way we look at that turn of the century, American empire, the
Mhm.
way we traditionally define that era.
Yeah, and we sort of focus in on the progressive era, robber barons. I mean, there's just sort of a skip
Yep.
over a lot of this stuff, and we get to the Niagara movement, but we're thinking in small, well, a small number of geographic areas,
Yeah.
and Black people are doing things all over the country, are really
Yeah.
trying to realize, the promise of a new society, and doing it in lots of different ways, and we don't see that as often. Well, that's really important to pull out.
What about you?
Pardon
What?
me. My aha move. Well, there are lots of them.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose it's thinking about, well, Sally Hemings's father, John Wales, as a person who was described in all the literature that I'd read as a person who'd been trained as a lawyer in England. And in fact, he was a servant boy
Mhm.
and was brought over as a servant, which is a very, very different beginning for someone, right? I mean, it casts a different light to my mind. Makes me think about Jefferson's marriage in a different way, his wife in a different way, the difference between being the child of a person who was raised who was trained as a lawyer in England, which would probably point to a somewhat prosperous,
Mhm.
stable background, versus someone who was a servant boy, is very,
Mhm.
very different. And it makes them different to his children, with
Yep.
Elizabeth Hemings as well, because he had been a servant,
Mhm.
white, but they were servants too. So he is not as far from them. What makes him far is that he had a man who um, believed in him, thought him that he was smart, and gave him an education, and so he could rise. But that's something that could never have happened to his children.
Yeah.
So that was of many. I know that's an unfair question, because I know doing this, there are lots of things that you're like,
Yeah.
wow, wow,
Yeah.
wow, I didn't even think about that.
Yeah.
But we have some questions here from people. And yeah, there you are.
Yes, we do have lots of questions. So
Mhm.
thank you for the conversation so far. There are actually two questions, Kerri, about Trotter's relationship with the Garrison family, with William Lloyd Garrison's descendants, given Trotter's idolization of Garrison and Deanie Trotter's work at Garrison's former home, and another question about the influence of Black and white abolitionists in general over Trotter's development and ideas.
Well, thank you so much for the question. So, in terms of the Garrisons, Trotter idolized William Lloyd Garrison, but I'm also careful in the book of saying that all of his editorials on Garrison and Garrison's significance always included talks about how Garrison was informed in his radicalism by the Black community in which he lived. So Garrison starts selling the Liberator 1831. Garrison himself said it was the Black community that kept the paper stable because they were the ones who purchased it the most. And so Trotter's idolization of Garrison really had to do with the fact that here was an example of somebody who had been inspired, influenced by the Black community in which he lived. Trotter's then disappointment with the next generation of Garrisons was that he really believed that they had, for lack of a better word, sold out, and he actually has a series of editorials in which he says selling themselves short. So basically argued that the next generation of Garrisons had intermarried with the Villards, who were owned a very famous newspaper in New York at the time, and that group of people had betrayed, again, the original radical promise that Garrison had. In terms of his relationship to abolitionists, Trotter was much closer to people like the Higginson family, Thomas Wentworth Higginson. He very much admired and formed partnerships with descendants of white abolitionists who were elected to office either in the state legislature in Massachusetts or in Congress and on the federal level. So he was very inspired by that moment, but he was always somebody, the way he framed it, which was sort of a very fascinating aspect of his, was he framed it as here are people who are white people who are letting the Black community guide the way they're figuring things out politically. And so that was where he came at it from. He had a Garrison commemoration day and a Sumner commemoration day multiple times throughout his career. And when he did that, he was always, I put out in the book, he was always very careful to put the names of Black radical abolitionists alongside those names, because his point was that these white people were the example, as he said, of what white possibility can be without the nonsense, is what he would say. It's kind of very funny when he wrote some of his editorials, right? And so he really said that, this is an example of white people listening to Black people and shaping their politics around that.
Great, thank you. So you've mentioned his opinion and relationship with Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. What about Marcus Garvey? Where did you stand on Garveyism?
So that's a good question. So Garvey, when Trotter died, Garvey was in England and wrote an editorial almost immediately. So he sends a telegram and he says that the race could have afforded to lose many other imitators, but they cannot afford to lose someone like a Trotter. So Marcus Garvey's nationalism and his internationalism appealed to Trotter. Marcus Garvey started organizing in Boston in 1919. And actually when he organizes the Black Star Line, Garvey recognized Trotter's populist appeal. And so he used the boat that Trotter used to go surreptitiously to the Paris Peace Conference. He used that boat to become one of the boats in his Black Star Line, Garvey. And so Garvey's relationship with Trotter was that he really admired Trotter. He thought that Trotter was different than what he called these so-called Negro leaders, and liked him. Trotter's relationship with Garvey was one of support and really believed that there was value in the Garvey movement. But by the early 1920s, Trotter was really disgusted by Garvey's relationship and overtures to white supremacists, specifically the Klan, and also Garvey's statements that Garvey made about pure-blooded, quote unquote, Negroes versus mixed-blooded Negroes, right? And so Trotter, for all of his faults, and I say this in the book, was somebody who really didn't traffic in that type of talk. Another thing that I found kind of amazing about him, and so he then, after that, was very sort of distanced himself from Garvey, but he valued the Garvey movement.
Well, you brought up his trip to the Paris peace talks. Could you talk a little bit about this? What was he doing at the League of Nations or at the Versailles Peace Treaty?
So Trotter saw as many African Americans and many people in the colonized world saw. He really saw an opportunity in World War I that this would be a turning point in world history, that this whole idea of self-determination, as articulated by President Wilson, was could potentially become a revelatory and revolutionary moment. When this World War I progresses, and as it progressed, and as this intense violence against African Americans, many of whom were still in uniform, as that violence escalated, Trotter began to see the war in a very different light. He began to see it as a opportunity for, as he's termed, the colored people of the world to place their grievances before the world. Because he believed, and as most people believed, this was like this cataclysmic moment in the history of the globe. And so he created something along with Hubert Harrison called the Liberty League. That was the only group of African-American leaders and activists to meet during World War I. Their goal was to have every single community across the country of Black people and basically set their grievances before the world. And so he sent out mass mailings to Black newspapers across the country. He told Black communities to elect their own representatives to meet in Washington, D.C. They came, and their goal was that they were going to state their grievances with the American government. And when the American government didn't listen, they were going to put that on the stage of the world. And so the Versailles Peace Conference happens, end of World War I happens. The Wilson administration denied passports to African-American activists, except for Robert Russell Moton, who was the president of Tuskegee and Du Bois. And Trotter managed to disguise himself as a cook, shave off his mustache, sneak onto a boat and make his way to Paris, where he did end up distributing this document to the newspaper, to the press. He got there, unfortunately, after the conference was over. But one of my points in the book is that regardless of sort of the white imagination reaction to him, this catapulted him into sort of this era of celebrity as somebody who was really seen as a hero to African-American people. And I'll never forget, when I was researching the book, I found that there was a church in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where there were all these copies, old copies of The Guardian. And I was wondering, why are they there? And it was because there's evidence that the Black community there would cut out speeches that Trotter gave and paste them on the walls. And one of the historical sites I went to, there was sort of all this oral history of the Black community in Tulsa. You wouldn't think them having this much interest in a Black man from Boston, really physically cutting out his speeches and his talks, cutting out the petition that he made through the Liberty League and pasting it on the wall so that the community could see them. So I think that kind of encapsulates the significance in the Black imagination of his trip, even if that trip didn't result in kind of material gains for colonized people.
But he certainly did a lot to become this voice for African Americans at this particular time. One of the key moments in your book, and there's a question about this, is about when the Birth of a Nation came to Boston and Trotter's protests against that. Can you talk a little bit about that moment?
Yeah, so one of the things about Birth of a Nation was that Trotter had been battling that narrative all the way back to the second issue of The Guardian in 1902. At the time, the movie Birth of a Nation is based on a series of books by Thomas Dixon that were immensely popular. I kind of made a joke the other day that they were kind of like the Twilight of their era. Like, everybody read those books. They were not particularly well written. They weren't particularly, but they were books that were extremely popular. And Trotter, beginning in 1902, protested that they were being given out in public schools in Massachusetts to teach kids how to read. And he ended up working with the school department in Boston, and they actually got rid of putting those in classrooms. And so by the time Birth of a Nation came out, Trotter had been tracking this film for, over a decade, the making of this story. He was determined that this narrative of what Reconstruction was wrong. His father and many people in his family and many people he grew up around had been office holders in the South. And had been, violently repelled from the South. And so he could remember that. And so he was adamant that the film was not a matter of freedom of speech. It was racist propaganda that, as he said, is going to lead to death. And so he's really one of the first people to point that out, right? So his argument was never that should he show the film. His argument was that the film itself was putting people's lives at risk. And of course, he was correct at that, right? Right after that film was shown in Georgia, the new Ku Klux Klan came into being in 1915. So Trotter's protest was built around that premise, right? That this was a film that had nothing to do with film, your right to release a film. It had everything to do with putting African-American people in harm's way. And so he helped organize these massive protests on Boston Common, outside the State House, the theaters where the movie was shown. And to put it into context to people, how big this film was, Massachusetts at the time, to welcome the film, had this parade of Klansmen go down Tremont Street to celebrate that the film was coming. And Trotter's, argument was that this is a hateful, insightful movie. And so he really wanted to get it out of the conversation of, well, should a movie be shown? And out of the, well, what is the movie being shown? He also was acting at a time when Boston was notorious for banning things. So famous statement, banned in Boston. So yeah. everything was banned in Boston. There was one play that couldn't be shown in Boston because the woman who was reciting a Bible verse showed her ankles. And this is in 1906. So Trotter's argument was that how ridiculous is it that we are known as a city that has this puritanical approach to public entertainment, and yet arguably the most racist film made at the time, we allow it to be shown. So that was where his protest came from. He also really believed that this was a moment for the Black community itself across New England to show that they were real people and that this had consequences for them, rather than that this was a film that was benign and that it was only being seen and absorbed and expressed by white people, that this would have a immediate effect on Black communities, not just in the South, but across the country.
I could just interject here quickly. The interesting thing about this is that at the same time he's doing that, out in California, Frederick Madison Roberts, who's the grandson of Madison Hemings, basically his cousin, who's a newspaper editor, is doing the same thing, fostering the same kind of protests, talking about this very much in his newspaper.
Yes, I mean, and what's fascinating to me, I mean, you asked what things fascinate me doing the research, is just and this is probably something I would entrust to you, Annette Gordon-Reed, is how the Hemingses, Isaacses leave that little area in Western Virginia and Ohio, and then branch into what is California, and create all these other newspapers out there. That have a similar way of seeing the world and conceptualizing race and politics as The Guardian did. And for my book, I couldn't come across like a source that said, okay, Trotter is talking directly to to his cousins who are like distant cousins in California. So I couldn't say that, but I was like, there has to be a smoking gun somewhere that shows there's there's like some type of connection. But I couldn't find like the source.
I'm doing a second volume of the Hemings family story, so that's one of the things that I will be looking at.
Yeah. Wonderful. Because it's so fascinating, because it's as Trotter is doing these things, and my poor editor had to take out the stuff. I was like, oh, there's all these people over here in Ohio, and then they're in Wisconsin, and then they're in California, and they were like, just concentrate on Trotter. But I think that speaks to the legacy of a radical racial political orientation within a group of people and within a community, and how that can survive over time.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
Excellent. We have too many questions that have poured in. Again, I'm sorry we're not going to get to all of them, but we'll make sure to share them with Professor Greenidge after. I want to ask one last question, though. This came in. Is there a particular text, an essay or editorial or book by Trotter that you would recommend as an introduction to his writing? Of course, read your book first. But
this is what was so maddening, is that the surviving issues of The Guardian are where to start. So the library at BU has the Trotter papers. If you do like a basic newspaper search in old African American newspaper, like a database, and type in Trotter, other newspapers reprinted his editorials within them. And so that's where you can get at sort of his voice and what he was saying. He was really adamant that everything had to go into the paper. So it's frustrating because he wasn't somebody who said, oh, I'm going to collect everything into a book and put it out. It was, oh, just buy The Guardian, and every week I'm saying something. So I would urge people, and just Black newspapers are fascinating historical artifacts. Just look at those and see the editorials that he wrote. That's where I would start.
Thank you so much, Kerri. Thank you so much, Annette, for joining us. Catherine, would you like to say a few words?
Well, I was reflecting that our goal is to make the Massachusetts Historical Society a place for good conversation. And boy, that happened here tonight. Thank you so much to both of you. And congratulations again to Kerri. This is wonderful.
Thank you so much. Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much.